Winter, the season of cozy blankets, hot chocolates, and holiday cheer, unless you lived in Victorian-era London. Then, winter was a merciless beast, hell-bent on breaking your spirit and possibly your bones. Imagine frigid winds slicing through the gaps in your brick walls, waking up with your water basin frozen solid, and walking to work in shoes so thin you might as well be barefoot. That's if you had shoes. But wait, there's more. Your only source of warmth? A smoky coal fire that choked the room before it heated it. Step outside and you're swallowed by a toxic yellow fog thick enough to lose your kids in. And good luck buying food, if the carts could even get through the sludge-filled streets. For the poor, freezing to death wasn't some tragic accident. It was expected. From lethal fogs and frozen pipes to workhouse misery and icy sewage rivers, we're diving into why winters in Victorian London weren't just cold, they were brutal. If you think your heating bill is bad now, buckle up, because by the end of this journey, you'll be thanking your thermostat like it's royalty. London, home of Big Ben, bustling markets, and absolute winter misery in the Victorian era. Forget everything you know about winter today. Snow days, central heating, or sipping lattes in thermal socks. Back in the 1800s, winter in London wasn't some postcard scene, it was a seasonal death sentence. Welcome to the Victorian freeze, where every breath burned, every step slipped, and every day was a battle to stay alive. Now let's set the stage. It's the mid-19th century. Queen Victoria is on the throne, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing, and London is a booming metropolis bursting at the seams with people, horses, coal smoke, and, unfortunately, a serious lack of basic comfort. For starters, housing was a nightmare. The wealthy elite had grand estates and servants to keep the fires lit, sure, but the average Londoner? They lived in overcrowded tenement buildings, slapped together quickly to meet the exploding demand for housing. Think crumbling bricks, paper-thin walls, and no insulation whatsoever. You could practically hear your neighbor's teeth chattering through the walls. These homes were freezing. And we're not talking put on a sweater cold. We're talking wake up with frost on your blanket cold. A single coal fire, if you could afford coal, might warm the room just enough to prevent you from turning into a popsicle. And that's one room. The rest of the house? Forget it. Bedrooms were so cold, people sometimes wore hats and gloves to bed. And if you were poor, and in Victorian London millions were, you didn't even get that. Many families lived in a single room, one smoky, damp room. The idea of warmth was a luxury, not a guarantee. Children would huddle around tiny fires, if they had any, and those without any fuel would literally shiver themselves to sleep. It was survival of the warmest. But hey, let's go outside. Maybe a brisk walk will get your blood flowing? Not so fast. The streets of London were like an obstacle course from hell during winter. Snow would fall and mix with ash, animal waste, and industrial runoff to form a thick, freezing sludge. And since the city didn't exactly have snowplows or salt trucks, the streets just stayed that way. Treacherous, icy, and putrid. Want to cross the road? You might fall and break your leg. Want to get to work? Too bad. Your boots are soaked through and your toes are going numb. The idea of waterproof anything didn't exist. Once your feet were wet, they stayed wet, and frostbite was just a cold breeze away. Then there's the infamous fog. Victorian London was known for its thick, choking pea soupers. Fogs so dense and toxic that you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. And they weren't just fog, they were smog, a mix of natural mist and the byproduct of burning thousands of tons of coal. Breathing it in was like smoking 20 cigarettes a day while walking through a coal mine. Visibility dropped to zero, and walking the streets became a gamble. You might end up in the river, under a carriage, or lost entirely. Meanwhile, disease thrived in this icy, dirty, overcrowded city. Cold weather pushed people indoors, huddled together for warmth in unventilated rooms. Colds turned into pneumonia, flu became deadly, And let's not forget tuberculosis, the disease that practically had VIP status in Victorian London. And while all this misery unfolded, the city's rich carried on. They had thick coats, big fires, and servants to bring them tea. But even they weren't safe from the bone-deep chill or the health risks that came with it. Winter was an equalizer, though not in a kind way. It reminded everyone, rich or poor, that nature didn't care how many top hats you owned. So why didn't people just leave London during winter? Well, where would they go? For most Londoners, the city was all they had. Their jobs, their families, their survival. It was all tied to that smog-choked maze of brick and coal. Leaving wasn't an option. You just bundled up, braved the freeze, and prayed for spring. This wasn't just a cold season. It was a test, a trial by ice, soot, and desperation. And it was just the beginning. So, you've made it off the icy, slush-covered streets of Victorian London and back to the safety of your humble abode. Congratulations! You've escaped the frostbite. Or have you? See, in the 19th century, shutting the front door didn't shut out the cold. In fact, the cold was just getting comfortable. Welcome to the inside of a Victorian home in winter, where the temperature might be only slightly warmer than outside and indoor comfort was more of a concept than a reality. Let's talk construction. Most working-class homes were made quickly and cheaply, with no regard for warmth. Thin brick walls, gaping floorboards, and single-pane windows meant the cold wind had VIP access to every room. The wind didn't just whistle, it howled. It found every crack, crevice, and loose window frame, slipping in like a ghost to haunt your already miserable evening. Heating? If you were lucky, you had a small fireplace, typically one per household, and often in just the main room. It burned coal, which wasn't exactly cheap. The fire took ages to start, barely warmed the room, and filled the air with thick, dry soot. And it needed constant tending. Let the fire die overnight? Congratulations, you're waking up in an icebox. And don't expect to heat the whole house. Bedrooms were never heated unless you were wealthy. The idea of a warm, cozy bed was mostly a fantasy for the working class. Instead, people slept in full layers of clothing, sometimes even their day clothes, topped with heavy wool blankets and anything else they could pile on. Hats, gloves, scarves, all worn to bed. Some families even brought in heated bricks or hot water bottles wrapped in cloth, but these lost their warmth quickly and could crack in extreme cold. If you shared a bed, you were lucky. Not for the romance, mind you, but for the shared body heat. Siblings often huddled together under a single blanket, hoping their combined shivering would somehow generate enough warmth to survive the night. And speaking of nighttime, waking up in the middle of a Victorian winter night was pure horror. Your breath fogged the air above you, the basin of water on your dresser was frozen solid, and stepping onto the bare floor felt like dipping your foot into a snowbank. Want to visit the toilet? That meant venturing outside to the backyard privy, or worse, emptying a freezing cold chamber pot. Either way, nature's call was a frosty ordeal. Now let's get personal. Bathing. Did Victorians bathe in winter? Only if they had to. Why? Because heating enough water for a full bath took ages and cost money. There were no water heaters, no showers, no hot water taps, just kettles and patience. You'd fill a metal tub in the kitchen, often the only room with a fire, strip down in the cold, and wash yourself as quickly as possible before hypothermia set in. And you'd share the bath water with the whole family. First come, cleanest served. So, what did most people do? They didn't bathe. They sponge bathed, wiped down with rags, or didn't wash at all. Hygiene took a back seat to not freezing to death. And that wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. Dirty bodies in cold, damp homes led to skin diseases, lice, and respiratory infections. Cold spread like wildfire, and a simple sniffle could become a death sentence if pneumonia set in. Now imagine being sick in that environment. Shivering under a pile of blankets, coughing through the smoke-filled air, your chest tightening while rats scurried across the floor. The doctor? If you could afford one, he might show up, but chances are he'd just prescribe rest and fresh air, which in a house like this was practically a joke. And while we're talking about suffering indoors, let's not forget the psychological toll. Winter days were short, skies were gray, and homes were dark. Gas lighting or oil lamps barely lit a room, and candles didn't do much more. People spent long, frigid evenings in near darkness, trapped inside, often in silence, save for the winds moaning outside or the occasional coal pop from the fire. It was depressing, isolating, and cold in every sense of the word. So while the cold outside was brutal, the cold inside was personal. It invaded your home, your clothes, your bones. There was no escape, just endurance. Winter wasn't a season, it was a siege. Picture this. You step outside your already freezing Victorian home, hoping for a little fresh air, only to find yourself swallowed by a thick, yellowish-green fog that smells like burning tires, wet dog, and a hint of death. Congratulations, you've entered a classic London pea souper. And no, that's not a soup. That's a toxic cloud rolling through your neighborhood like an invisible murderer. Welcome to one of the most infamous and deadly features of Victorian winter, the smog. Not just fog, not just smoke, but a suffocating blend of both, courtesy of the Industrial Revolution and London's love affair with coal. Here's how it worked. During winter, every household in London was burning coal to keep warm. Not clean-burning coal either. This was the cheap, sulfur-laden kind that billowed black smoke and left a greasy film on every surface. Now add in factories, thousands of chimneys, and a complete lack of environmental regulations. Then throw in some cold, damp air that traps the pollution close to the ground, and voila! You've got yourself a smog stew that could blot out the sun. Visibility? Often just a few feet. People got lost walking to their own front doors. Horses stumbled into the Thames. There were accounts of men falling into open graves during funerals because they literally couldn't see where they were going. If you couldn't navigate by smell, you were doomed. And this wasn't a once-in-a-while thing. In some winters, these smogs lasted days, sometimes even weeks. Londoners would wake up to find their streets, schools, and workplaces hidden behind a thick, ghostly veil. Gas lamps barely penetrated it. People walked with scarves wrapped around their mouths, not for fashion, but to keep their lungs from choking. Let's talk about those lungs for a moment. Breathing in Victorian smog wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. The air was saturated with sulfur dioxide, soot particles, and industrial chemicals. For someone with asthma, bronchitis, or tuberculosis, the smog could quite literally kill them, and it often did. Infants and the elderly were the most vulnerable. Hospitals would fill with people suffering from what doctors called fog pneumonia, or smoke lung. But even healthy adults weren't spared. Chronic coughing, nosebleeds, and blackened mucus were so common they were basically seasonal trends. And you couldn't just stay inside. The smog seeped in through cracks, under doors, and through the chimney flue. There was no escape. Your house might be cold and damp, but at least it wasn't actively trying to suffocate you, except during a smog, when it absolutely was. Newspapers tried to warn people. Stay indoors, they'd say. Don't exert yourself. But life had to go on. Factory workers still had to clock in. Children still had to walk to school. Even the Queen wasn't immune. Buckingham Palace itself disappeared into the smog more than once, like a ghost castle in a cursed swamp. It got so bad that even crime increased during these thick fogs. Thieves and pickpockets loved the smog. You couldn't see their face, couldn't see them coming, and couldn't see them leave. A perfect cover. One moment you were walking down Fleet Street, the next, bam, no wallet and you're face first in horse manure, again. Even literature of the time reflected the terror of the fog. Charles Dickens, Arthur Conan Doyle, and countless Gothic horror writers leaned into the imagery. Gas lamps flickering dimly through the murk, footsteps echoing in empty alleys, sinister shadows lurking just beyond view. It was the perfect backdrop for mystery and murder, because it was real. And as horrifying as this was, the Victorians just accepted it. It wasn't until the 20th century, long after Queen Victoria was gone, that real steps were taken to reduce London's air pollution. But during the 1800s, winter meant cold, darkness, and a very real chance of suffocating in your own street. So while the cold could kill you slowly, the smog could do it fast. One deep breath, and your lungs were marinating in soot. It's no wonder Londoners were constantly coughing. It wasn't the flu. It was the air itself, waging war on their bodies. So, you've survived the killer fog, dodged a few pickpockets in the gloom, and made it back inside your barely warm tenement. Time to get dressed. But not for fashion. Oh no. In Victorian London winter, getting dressed was a full-blown survival tactic. Because once that frost set in, your only real defense was fabric. Lots and lots of itchy, heavy, never quite dry fabric. Victorian fashion during the winter was no joke. Think of it like armor, not against swords, but against the bitter cold that tried to stab you through every seam. But here's the catch. Even with all the layering, you were often still cold. Let's start with the ladies. A respectable woman in the 1800s didn't just throw on a coat and call it a day. No, she began with multiple layers of undergarments. Drawers, a chemise, corset, petticoats, sometimes 2 or 3 of them, and maybe a flannel underskirt. Over that came her dress, which was already made of heavy wool or cotton, and then add a shawl, muff, gloves, bonnet, and a thick winter cloak or coat. Sometimes a woman could be wearing 7 to 10 layers just to leave the house. And what did all that get her? A slow march through the streets, barely able to move, sweating under the layers but somehow still shivering. If it rained, which it often did, her skirts would soak up freezing slush and become heavy as bricks. A stylish death trap, really. Men, on the other hand, weren't exactly lounging in thermal fleece either. Their daily getup might start with long woolen undergarments, then shirt, waistcoat, trousers, and a thick overcoat. Add a cravat or scarf, gloves, and a tall hat. Some even wore overcoats on top of overcoats, like chilly Victorian onions. Children? Forget it. The layering game was even worse for them, because they were expected to wear miniature versions of adult clothes. Little girls bundled up in heavy skirts and petticoats, while boys were stuffed into stiff wool coats and itchy scarves. And remember, kids had to walk everywhere. School, church, work, it didn't matter if their fingers were going numb. Speaking of fingers, gloves were a must. But wool gloves got wet quickly, and leather ones were expensive. Many people just kept their hands in their coat sleeves or muffs. And as for feet, no such thing as waterproof boots. If it rained or snowed, your shoes soaked through, and that was the end of warm toes. Wool socks only helped until they turned into damp sponges. Now let's talk about laundry, because all these layers didn't wash themselves. In fact, winter laundry was a nightmare. No washing machines, no dryers, just basins of icy water and elbow grease. Clothes took forever to dry, especially indoors, where the cold, damp air clung to every fabric. Mildew and stink were common, and re-washing your underclothes too often meant risking frozen fingers in the process. And here's the cruel irony. All these clothes, designed to keep you warm, often just trapped cold air. That corset you were squeezing into, it restricted your movement and made it harder to generate body heat. Those layers on layers, they absorbed moisture from the air and weighed you down without ever really keeping the chill out. Fashion wasn't just impractical, it was sometimes deadly. Poor women wearing long skirts could slip on icy streets and fall into the path of a carriage. Children bundled into so many layers they couldn't run away from danger. And the elderly, slowed down by heavy woolen coats, often couldn't make it indoors in time to escape the cold. Of course, if you were wealthy, things were a little better. You had better quality fabrics, fur-lined coats, and actual servants to help you dress. You could afford custom boots and stylish muffs and multiple clean sets of clothing. But for the vast majority of Londoners, layering was more desperation than decoration. It wasn't about looking good, it was about surviving the next hour outside. And even then, you were probably still cold. So, next time you complain about how long it takes to put on your parka and gloves, remember, a Victorian Londoner had to layer like a lasagna just to survive the walk to the bakery. Winter in Victorian London didn't pause for anyone. It didn't care about your frostbitten fingers, your hack and cough, or the fact that your socks were frozen to your boots. You were expected to work, and if you didn't eat. And if you didn't eat, well, let's just say the Thames wasn't the only thing turning cold. In modern times, we hear phrases like snow day or work from home. In Victorian times, that concept didn't exist. For the lower classes especially, winter was not a time to rest.
It was a time to work harder, longer, and under even more dangerous conditions, just to survive. Let's start with the outdoor laborers. Dock workers, street sweepers, delivery boys, chimney sweeps, costermongers, those were street sellers by the way, they were all still expected to show up before sunrise, no matter the temperature. Imagine trying to haul sacks of coal or crates of fish through snow and ice in fingerless gloves and hole-ridden boots. Not only were you cold, you were wet, filthy, and often bruised from slipping on icy cobblestones.
Then there were the mudlarks, children, often as young as 5 or 6, who scavenged in the freezing, sewage-laced mud of the Thames for scraps to sell. They would wade barefoot in icy water looking for bits of rope, coal, or nails. It was dangerous and disgusting, and yes, they got sick, all the time. But they had to choose between frostbite and starvation. Most chose frostbite. Factory workers didn't have it much better. You'd think being indoors would offer some relief, but Victorian factories were barely warmer than the outside air, and twice as dangerous. The windows were drafty, the machines were loud and unguarded, and the floors were slippery from condensation. Coal dust mixed with cold air created a choking environment, and breaks were rare. Child labor was rampant. You could be 12 years old working a 12-hour shift next to a boiling vat of chemicals, with the boss screaming if you dared to rub your frozen fingers. And then there were the matchstick girls, working with white phosphorus in poorly ventilated rooms to produce matches. Not only was it cold, but inhaling the fumes gave them a disease called phossy jaw, which caused their facial bones to rot, literally rot. But they worked anyway, because if they didn't, someone else would. Even the so-called better jobs, like clerks or shop assistants, came with challenges. Offices were unheated, pens froze, ink congealed. You had to write by hand wearing gloves and overcoats, your breath fogging up the glass as you tried to finish ledgers or invoices. And shops? No heaters. Customers walked in from the cold and brought it with them. You stood on freezing wooden floors all day, often without sitting, with only a cold lunch to keep you going. Women, especially those in domestic service, faced a different kind of winter torture. They rose before dawn to light fires for their employers, often with numb fingers and no breakfast. Their quarters, usually in the attic or basement, were the coldest parts of the house. Laundry maids had to scrub linens in icy water. Cooks stood by coal stoves, which were hot in front and freezing behind. And if they got sick, they were often dismissed. No job, no reference, no hope. And for the unemployed or sick, winter was a death sentence. If you couldn't work, you couldn't afford coal or food. You might end up in a workhouse where labor was punishing and meals were meager. Or worse, on the street, huddled against a wall, hoping your rags would keep you alive until morning. And remember, there was no social safety net, no government aid, no sick days, no unions fighting for your rights. If you didn't show up, you were replaced. If you got frostbite and lost a finger, tough luck. Next. Victorian winter didn't just bring snow and ice. It brought pressure, the unrelenting pressure to work, no matter your condition. It was a season not of peace, but of panic. Every hour lost to the cold was an hour lost to hunger, debt, and desperation. If the freezing temperatures didn't break you, the damp would. In Victorian London, cold wasn't just about air. It was a wet, clinging, bone-deep cold that you couldn't shake no matter how many layers you wore or how close you got to the fire. This wasn't the crisp chill of a snowy countryside. This was urban damp, heavy, oily, and always just one breath away from mildew. London's climate was the perfect storm for misery. A river cutting through the city, constant rain, endless fog, and buildings built more for stacking people than keeping them warm or dry. And inside those homes, the damp was just as bad, sometimes worse. Let's start with housing. Most Londoners lived in narrow, poorly ventilated homes packed with multiple families. The walls were made of brick and mortar, which trapped moisture and never dried out. Ceilings wept. Windows dripped with condensation. And wallpaper, it didn't just peel, it grew things. Mold was everywhere, creeping up from the skirting boards like a silent invader. The floors were cold stone or rotting wood, and most houses didn't have rugs unless you were wealthy. And carpets? They soaked up the damp like a sponge and then never dried. Walk across one in your bare feet, and it was like stepping into a wet swamp. People didn't even bother hanging laundry sometimes because it just sat there in the cold air, damp, sagging, and smelling worse than when it started. Sleeping was its own damp nightmare. Beds were stuffed with straw or old horsehair, and the sheets, if you had them, were rarely truly dry in winter. You'd crawl into bed fully dressed, often with your coat still on, huddled under a pile of whatever fabric you could find. But even then, your breath would form icy crystals on your blanket. Waking up meant peeling your clothes off the damp mattress like a soggy sandwich wrapper. And once you were out of bed, you had to get dressed, in the cold, in damp clothes, because unless you were rich, you didn't own a full wardrobe of dry, clean outfits. Your coat was the same one you wore yesterday, soaked by rain and fog, still damp at the cuffs, still reeking of coal smoke. The damp invaded your body too. Joints ached constantly. Children developed rickets from the combination of cold, wet, and lack of sunlight. Respiratory diseases like bronchitis and pneumonia weren't seasonal, they were ever present because people spent the winter breathing in moldy air, coal fumes, and freezing damp with every breath. Bathrooms, when they existed, were often in outhouses. So if you needed to relieve yourself in the middle of the night, you had to step into the rain-soaked backyard, or worse, use a chamber pot in your freezing, mildewed room. Either way, it was grim, and no one wanted to be the one to empty the pot in the morning. Even in the wealthier homes, damp was an issue. Grand estates might have more fireplaces, but they were drafty, and the damp crept in through the stone walls. Mold didn't care about your class, it just cared about moisture. People tried to fight back. Coal fires blazed in the hearths, boiling kettles filled rooms with steam, and cloth was stuffed into windowsills and door cracks to block the drafts. But it never really worked. At best, you just made your home a warm, steamy mold palace. At worst, you had both damp and soot choking you to sleep. And let's not forget, there were no dehumidifiers, no double glazing, no central heating. If your walls were wet, they stayed wet. If your boots were damp, they stayed damp. If your lungs started wheezing from the cold, heavy air, you hoped you didn't cough yourself into the workhouse. The Victorian winter damp wasn't just a comfort problem, it was a health hazard. It made everything heavier, slower, and more exhausting. It was inescapable. You couldn't dry off. You couldn't warm up. You could only keep going and hope that spring arrived before your lungs gave out. By this point, you're cold, you're wet, you haven't seen the sun in days. But you haven't hit rock bottom yet. Not until winter starts taking little bites out of your flesh. Because in Victorian London, the real horror wasn't just the weather, it was what it did to your body. Enter frostbite and chilblains, two lovely little punishments dished out by the season with no mercy. Let's start with frostbite, the big one. It creeps in slowly. First, your fingers or toes go numb. No big deal, you think. Then the skin turns pale, waxy, and hard to the touch. You might not even feel it happening because, hey, everything's numb anyway. But once that numbness starts wearing off, the pain hits like a hammer. And if you're unlucky or poor, which often meant the same thing, you don't have time to stop working or warm up. That's when tissue starts dying. Blackened fingertips, necrosis, infections, in extreme cases, amputation.
And no, this wasn't some rare freak accident. For the poor and working class who had to labor outside all winter, frostbite was a real threat. Chimney sweeps, dock workers, delivery boys, even police officers on the beat. Anyone spending long hours in the cold without proper boots or gloves could expect at least mild frostbite every winter. But let's not forget frostbite's mean little cousin, chilblains. Sounds like a quaint Victorian dessert, right? Wrong. Chilblains are itchy, burning swellings caused by repeated exposure to cold and damp, followed by too rapid rewarming. Your fingers and toes swell up, turn red or purple, and feel like they're on fire. They crack open, they bleed, they throb, and worst of all, there's no real cure. Just rest, warmth, and time, which most Victorian workers didn't have. Children suffered the most. Poorly clothed, with thin wool gloves and worn-out boots, they were often outside for hours, delivering messages, selling matches, or helping parents with market work. Their small, fragile extremities were the perfect targets. Some children developed chronic chilblains that left their hands permanently swollen and deformed. The elderly and sick didn't fare much better. Cold homes and limited movement meant blood circulation slowed, making them prime victims for frostbite or chilblains even indoors. Imagine trying to survive the winter in a drafty attic with no fire, your feet swelling and splitting open from the cold. And there's no doctor coming unless you can pay. And the cures? Oh, they were special. Popular Victorian remedies included rubbing chilblains with onions, salt and vinegar paste, or even urine. Yes, you read that right. Pee on your hands. That was someone's grandmother's idea of science. Other treatments involved wrapping the affected area in raw meat or animal fat, because why not smell terrible and suffer? Some well-meaning Victorians advised people to plunge their swollen fingers into ice water, then immediately switch to hot. This did not work. It often made things worse, opening the skin and leading to infection. But in an age without antibiotics, desperate people tried anything. Of course, if you were wealthy, the story changed. You had real gloves, fur-lined boots, carriages to keep you off the street, heated rooms with thick carpets, and a roaring fire. Even then, the cold might nip at you, but it didn't consume you like it did the poor. But for the rest of the population, frostbite and chilblains were part of winter's routine. You didn't go to a doctor, you just lived with it. You wrapped your bleeding hands in rags and went back to work. You limped through the snow with numb toes, praying they wouldn't turn black before spring. It wasn't just discomfort, it was daily pain. Living proof that the cold in Victorian London wasn't some romantic Dickensian snowfall, it was a ruthless bodily assault. You might think that the simplest way to survive a Victorian winter was to light a nice, cozy fire. Easy, right? Just throw some logs on the hearth and toast your frozen toes. But here's the problem. Everything in Victorian London had a price, and warmth was a luxury many simply couldn't afford. In the 1800s, coal was king. It powered factories, fueled trains, and heated homes. But unless you were rich enough to order it by the ton, it came at a painful price. Poor families had to buy coal by the handful, the bucket, or the sack. And if you couldn't afford it, you shivered. Simple as that. Coal sellers, often dirty-faced boys with soot-streaked cheeks, would walk the streets with sacks of coal for sale. Families scraped together pennies to buy enough to last a day or two. And if they couldn't, they burned wood scraps, paper, or anything flammable. Old furniture, shoes, even dry dung. Fires weren't just about comfort. In many homes, especially in slum tenements or workhouse dormitories, the fireplace was the only source of heat, the only way to cook, and the only light source after sunset. Without coal, the entire home went cold and dark.
Now imagine sharing one fireplace with 3 or 4 families. That's what many tenement buildings looked like. The fire might be on in the common room, but not in the bedrooms. So children huddled together under thin blankets while frost crept across the window panes and ice formed in their water jugs. Even when people did manage to get a fire going, it wasn't always pleasant. Victorian coal fires didn't burn clean. They smoked, they stank, they spewed thick black soot and that clung to walls, ceilings, and lungs. And with poor ventilation, many homes were toxic boxes of smoke, coal dust, and damp. This brings us to the infamous London fog, that thick yellow-gray soup that blanketed the city every winter. The fog wasn't just weather, it was coal smoke. Millions of fireplaces, factories, and steam engines churned out clouds of soot, which mixed with cold air and moisture to create the dense smog known as a pea souper. People walked the streets with handkerchiefs over their mouths. Shopkeepers wiped black residue from their windows daily. And inside homes, walls turned gray from smoke. The cost of staying warm wasn't just financial, it was physical. Your lungs paid the price. The poorest of the poor, especially the homeless and those in workhouses, had it worst. Fires were rationed, if allowed at all. In many workhouses, the rule was simple.
fires were for the administrators and sick wards, not for the laborers. If you wanted warmth, you had to earn it with back-breaking work, and even then, it might only last an hour. So people got creative. Children snuck into coal yards at night to steal lumps of coal. Families collected cinders from the street. Some people risked arrest by scavenging firewood from private property or tearing down abandoned fences. Anything that could burn did. A whole underground economy grew around coke, a cheaper, dirtier byproduct of coal used by the desperate. It was foul-smelling and barely produced heat, but it was better than freezing. There were even penny fires in some neighborhoods, a shared fire people could stand around for a fee. Picture a modern bonfire, but grimier, smokier, and surrounded by starving kids and exhausted workers. Meanwhile, the upper classes lounged in warm parlors. Their fireplaces roared, servants fed the flames, and footmen brought hot tea to the drawing room. In some cases, they had fires in every room, including bedrooms, dining halls, and studies. Warmth was a status symbol. Cold was for the poor. In short, warmth wasn't a human right. It was a privilege. If you couldn't pay for it, you simply did without. Your skin cracked, your breath steamed in your own home, your fingers turned purple. And all the while, the fire in someone else's mansion roared on. If you managed to survive the cold, the damp, the frostbite, and the coal smoke, don't celebrate just yet. Because in Victorian London, winter didn't just chill your bones, it invaded your lungs, and that's when things got deadly. Winter illness wasn't a possibility, it was an expectation. Everyone got sick. The difference was who had the money to survive it. Let's start with the all-too-familiar villain, bronchitis. The damp air and coal-choked smog irritated the lungs like sandpaper. For the poor, living in one-room slums with no ventilation and 5 people sharing a bed, catching a cough was practically guaranteed. And once it started, it rarely ended well. A simple winter cold often turned into something much worse: pneumonia, tuberculosis, or even pleurisy. In an era without antibiotics, these were more than just uncomfortable, they were lethal. A child with a fever might start coughing up blood by week's end. An elderly woman with a chill might be gone in days, and no one, not even the doctor, could stop it. And yes, there were doctors, but let's talk about them. Medicine wasn't free in Victorian London. You didn't just stroll into a clinic for a checkup. There were apothecaries for medicine, physicians for diagnoses, and surgeons for operations. All of them cost money, and none of them guaranteed results.
If you were poor, seeing a doctor might mean sacrificing your rent money or going without food for a week. Many families delayed calling a doctor until the very last minute, when the patient was nearly dead. By then, the doctor could do little more than offer a tonic, say a few words in Latin, and write out a bill you couldn't afford to pay. Hospitals existed, but they weren't places you wanted to go. They were seen as last resorts, full of disease, squalor, and overcrowded with patients stacked side by side. You might leave sicker than you arrived. Worse yet, hospitals were often segregated by class. If you were poor, you got a cot in the charity ward, if you got a bed at all. Home remedies were more common and often terrifying. You'd be lucky to get lemon and honey. More likely, you were fed camphor, mercury, bleeding leeches, or alcohol mixed with opium. Children were dosed with laudanum to make them sleep through the pain. It was less treatment and more survival roulette. And then there was tuberculosis, the great winter killer. Known then as consumption, it was slow, painful, and romanticized in art. But in reality, it was horrific. You wasted away, you coughed blood, you drowned slowly in your own lungs. In the tight, damp spaces of tenement housing, it spread like wildfire. One infected family member meant the entire household was at risk. Even upper-class homes weren't immune. Though they had fires and servants and medicine, they still suffered from the same polluted air and close contact with sickly staff. A governess might bring a cough into the nursery. A footman might infect the dinner party. Disease didn't care about wealth, but wealth was the only way to fight it. Poor people often turned to quack doctors and miracle cures sold in the streets.
Bottles of mystery liquids promised to heal the lungs or cure winter fever. Most were just alcohol and herbs. Some were downright dangerous. But when your child was burning up and you had no money, hope was worth the gamble. The cruelest part? There was no social safety net, no insurance, no public health care. Getting sick meant falling behind on rent, losing your job, and possibly ending up in the workhouse, where conditions were even colder, dirtier, and more dangerous. Illness wasn't just a health crisis, it was a financial disaster. So every winter, Londoners braced for more than cold. They braced for loss. Loss of health, loss of income, loss of family members who didn't make it to spring. The coughing never stopped, the fevers never cooled, and the doctor's bill always came due. When you think Victorian fashion, you probably imagine top hats, corsets, and fancy gowns dripping with lace. But for most Londoners, winter wasn't a fashion show. It was a desperate battle to stay warm in a city that wanted to freeze you out. The reality? Most people weren't dressed in silk or velvet. They were layered head to toe in rags, hand-me-downs, and whatever could be scrapped together to hold in body heat. Let's start with the poor. For working-class families, clothes were a scarce resource. Children wore pants and dresses handed down from older siblings or neighbors. Men patched holes in their coats with scraps of fabric, often stuffing the lining with straw or newspaper to trap warmth. Wool was king because it kept heat better than cotton, but good wool was expensive, so it was often thin, worn, and full of holes. Underneath all those layers, people rarely had undergarments that were clean or dry. In fact, washing was a luxury, and clothes often went weeks, sometimes months, without proper cleaning. This meant that people slept in damp, dirty layers that only worsened the cold and the spread of disease. Shoes were a nightmare. Most working-class Londoners had leather boots that leaked like sieves. Come winter, wet feet were the norm, leading to chilblains and worse. Many people patched their boots with scraps of leather or wrapped their feet in cloth to keep the cold out, but it was never enough.
Women had it even harder. Victorian society expected them to look presentable, even in the cold. But maintaining appearances meant sacrificing warmth for fashion. Corsets restricted circulation, heavy skirts and petticoats weighed you down, and gloves or hats were often luxuries. Poor women layered multiple skirts and petticoats, but without warm underclothes, the chill still seeped in. The wealthy had fur-lined coats, gloves, and hats, but their servants? They got old, thin coats and cheap scarves that barely cut the biting wind. One desperate tactic was layering, putting on every piece of clothing you had, no matter how ragged or mismatched, hoping that bulkiness would trap enough heat to keep frostbite at bay. People even stuffed their collars with cotton or wool scraps. Scarves and shawls wrapped multiple times around the neck helped block the damp wind. In crowded workhouses, where many poor Londoners sought refuge, the clothing situation was bleak. Uniforms or rags, whichever you were given, with no chance to replace or repair. Winter was brutal when you had nothing but threadbare fabric between your skin and the cold. Kids often went out to work in these clothes, selling newspapers, running errands, or sweeping chimneys, exposed to freezing winds and relentless rain. They were walking proof that survival, not style, was the order of the day. Victorians also used cloaks and shawls, often wrapped tight around the body as portable blankets during the day. These could be pulled up over heads to protect faces from rain and fog, but even these were thin and worn by the time winter set in. On the streets, it was common to see layers of mismatched clothing, shabby coats over tattered sweaters, patched trousers, scarves knotted around faces. No one looked neat. Everyone looked cold. The truth? Even all the layers in the world couldn't fully stop the chill. Clothing could only do so much against a damp, icy London winter. People were still frozen by morning, bodies aching from the cold. They were still shivering through long nights, coughing and wheezing in threadbare beds. So layering wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a matter of life or death. And if your clothes weren't enough, you faced the cruel alternatives of frostbite, illness, or worse. Winter in Victorian London didn't just freeze your bones inside your home, it turned the entire city into a slippery, dangerous trap.
The streets themselves became enemies, a harsh gauntlet you had to cross every day just to survive. Imagine this: thick, choking fog hanging low like a ghost, mixing with coal smoke until the air is so heavy you can barely breathe. The damp seeps into your clothes, freezing them solid. The cobblestones underfoot turn slick with ice. Horseshoes clatter on frozen muck, and carriages splash slush and mud in every direction. You step carefully, but every misstep could mean a twisted ankle or worse. Public transport? In the early Victorian era, there wasn't much. The horse-drawn omnibuses were slow, crowded, and costly for the poor. Walking was often the only option, no matter how brutal the weather. For workers, traveling to their jobs, whether factories, markets, docks, or workshops, was a daily ordeal. No heated buses or subways here, just cold, rain, ice, and fog. The wealthy had carriages, but streets were congested and dangerous, with ice making accidents common. Horses struggled on slippery roads, sometimes collapsing from exhaustion or slipping into ditches. For the poor, sharing a ride was rare. If you couldn't walk, you were stuck. Slippery pavements meant constant falls. Broken bones were common, and there were no quick ambulances or emergency rooms, just pain, bruises, and days off work you couldn't afford. Street vendors tried to keep going, despite the cold, shouting their wares wrapped in thin coats. Kids selling matches or newspapers often stood outside for hours, their tiny hands numb, faces cracked from frostbite. Travel was also a health hazard. The cold and damp air made coughing worse. Crowded markets and public spaces turned into disease hotspots. You weren't just dodging ice, you were dodging germs.
Winter floods made things worse. The Thames sometimes rose, flooding basements and streets. Streets became rivers of freezing water, soaking feet and making the cold unbearable. Bridges iced over, and ferries slowed or stopped running. Even the police patrolling the streets struggled. They had to brave the elements to keep order in a city already on edge from hunger, illness, and despair. And there were the homeless, the street sleepers, people with no home to escape to. They huddled in doorways, alleyways, and under bridges, wrapped in scraps and cardboard. Winter was a slow death sentence for them, with hypothermia and starvation waiting in the dark. Victorians were aware of the danger. Some city officials tried to clear snow and salt roads, but it was a losing battle against the cold and grime. The city was simply not built for winter. By the late 1800s, the arrival of the Underground Railway helped, offering some relief to those who could afford the fare. But even then, stations were cold and damp, and the trains themselves were cramped and stuffy. For most Londoners, winter travel was a test of endurance, a daily grind of cold, mud, fog, and risk. Getting anywhere on time meant grit, luck, and sometimes a bit of foolish courage. Winter didn't just freeze London's streets, it froze its stomachs too. In Victorian London, food was never guaranteed, but the brutal winters made hunger an even crueler, more common companion. For the poor, putting food on the table was a daily challenge, and cold weather turned that challenge into a nightmare. First, let's talk about how winter affected food supply. Fresh fruits and vegetables disappeared from markets as frost killed crops across the countryside. Ice-covered roads delayed deliveries. Meat became scarce and expensive because farms had difficulty transporting animals. Fish, a cheap protein source, was limited when the Thames and other rivers iced over or froze in parts. Markets were damp, cold places where vendors shouted over the fog, but even they often had less to sell. Prices rose because food was scarce, and the poorest had to choose between paying for rent, coal, or bread. The most common meal for a poor Londoner in winter: a thin broth, stale bread, and perhaps a small piece of salted meat or dried peas if they were lucky. Children's meals were even more meager, often just a spoonful of gruel or porridge. This wasn't just a matter of hunger, it was malnutrition. Without vitamins and minerals from fresh food, bodies grew weak, immune systems faltered, and susceptibility to illness skyrocketed. Starving children were common sights on London streets, faces hollow and eyes sunken.
The problem wasn't just scarcity, but also storage. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly, especially in damp cellars. People often had to eat what they could get quickly or risk losing it to rot. This meant the poor were forced to eat whatever was cheapest and most filling, often with little nutritional value. Charitable soup kitchens and bread lines appeared during harsh winters, offering some relief, but the supply was limited and the lines long. The stigma attached to charity meant many families reluctant to seek help until they were desperate. Workhouse kitchens could provide hot meals, but only if you were already admitted, and getting in meant giving up freedom and dignity. Food in workhouses was basic and often of poor quality, enough to sustain life, but no more. Farmers and markets in rural areas also struggled. Harsh weather ruined harvest crops, making the price of food soar even for the middle class. Even some wealthy households felt the pinch as food prices rose, though they had the resources to weather the storm. Victorians had few options. Some turned to foraging, collecting roots, berries, or anything edible from parks or hedgerows. Others ate cheap, filling starches like potatoes, oats, or bread crusts. But it was never enough to stave off hunger during the worst months.
Hungry and cold, many families faced impossible choices: spend money on food or coal, feed the children, or keep the fire burning. The brutal winters forced people into impossible dilemmas, and many didn't survive the winter months. As the snow fell and the fog thickened, hunger gnawed at the city's soul. People grew desperate, some turning to theft or begging. Others succumbed quietly to starvation and illness, buried in unmarked graves. The brutal truth: winter was a killer, not just from cold, but from hunger. The two combined into a deadly cocktail that swallowed thousands every year. For many desperate Londoners, winter wasn't just about braving the cold. It was about choosing between freezing on the streets or entering a place that was almost worse, the workhouse. These institutions were meant to be a last resort, a refuge for those with nowhere else to turn. But in reality, they were cold, grim, and often brutal prisons where hope went to die. The workhouse system in Victorian England was designed as a deterrent. The idea was to make the conditions inside so harsh that only the truly desperate would enter. The mantra was simple: less eligibility. You were not supposed to live better in the workhouse than you would outside in poverty. And boy, did they deliver on that promise. Picture a massive, fortress-like building, stone walls towering over bleak courtyards. Inside, rows of beds in cold, drafty dormitories housed dozens of people who had nowhere else to go. The heating was minimal and coal was rationed tightly. The air was thick with the smell of damp, sweat, and despair. Winter only made these conditions worse. The cold seeped through cracked windows and poorly insulated walls. Many inmates shivered under threadbare blankets, their bodies weak from hunger and illness. The overcrowding ensured disease spread like wildfire. Families were often split up, men, women, and children housed separately. This cruel division stripped away the last comforts of human contact during the harshest season. Children, already vulnerable, faced long days of hard labor and scarce food. Workhouse food was basic and uninspiring: watery soup, coarse bread, and gruel. It was enough to keep you alive, but not enough to keep the cold or hunger at bay. There was no luxury, no warmth beyond the scant fire in the main hall. The daily routine was strict and punishing. Inmates performed hard labor, breaking stones, picking oakum, unraveling old ropes, or cleaning the workhouse. These tasks were meant to be grueling, to remind people why they shouldn't end up there. Sickness was common, with winter colds turning into deadly diseases like tuberculosis or pneumonia. The infirmary was often overwhelmed. Medical care was minimal, and many died quietly without proper treatment. Yet, for some, the workhouse was the only option. With no jobs, no family support, and freezing weather outside, the gates were a grim promise of survival, even if it meant a loss of freedom and dignity. Stories from survivors paint a grim picture: children starving, mothers begging for firewood, men losing their minds from isolation. Escape was rare and dangerous. Leaving meant facing the brutal streets again,
often without clothes or food. Outside, charitable organizations and reformers campaigned to improve workhouse conditions, but progress was slow and winters remained brutal for decades. For the poorest Londoners, the workhouse was a bitter choice between freezing or suffering. A cold prison with few comforts, it embodied the harsh reality of Victorian winter survival. In Victorian London, heat wasn't a luxury, it was a lifeline. Winter's brutal chill made every home, every room, and every street corner a battleground against the cold. But keeping warm came at a price, and for many, the struggle for fuel was as fierce as the frost outside.
Coal was king in London. The city's rapid industrial growth made it the fuel of choice, used to heat homes, power factories, and even light the streets. But owning enough coal to keep a fire burning all winter, that was a different story. For the wealthy, it was simple. Vast coal deliveries stacked by servants in big fireplaces that roared day and night. But for the working poor, coal was scarce and expensive. Many families couldn't afford enough to keep fires going consistently, meaning freezing nights huddled around tiny, sputtering embers. If you were lucky enough to have a fire, you had to ration coal like gold. One lump wasted was a night of freezing cold. Fires were often kept low to stretch supplies, barely providing warmth for more than one small room. Poor families sometimes resorted to burning whatever they could find: old furniture, wooden crates, and even scraps of fabric. This was dangerous, creating smoke-filled, poorly ventilated rooms that worsened respiratory problems. The smoky air inside homes was often worse than the chill outside. And then there were the coal riots of the 19th century, desperate protests by workers who couldn't afford rising fuel prices. These riots highlighted how vital coal was to survival and how the lack of it was a social crisis. Some families had no choice but to send children or adults out daily to buy small amounts of coal from street sellers. This was risky in freezing weather, and the cost added up fast, leaving less money for food or rent. The government tried to help by introducing coal depots or subsidies, but demand always outpaced supply during the harshest months. Plus, coal quality varied. Poor coal burned quickly and left more ash, meaning you needed even more just to get a decent fire. Fires were also a social center. In cramped, cold homes, families huddled around the hearth, sharing warmth and stories. But when coal ran out, so did hope. The desperate need for heat also made people vulnerable to scams. Sellers sometimes peddled fake coal, clay or cheap alternatives that burned poorly. People desperate to stay warm were often the easiest targets. Warming streets and public spaces were rare. There were a few heated public baths and shelters, but they were overcrowded and far from accessible for many. Even the factories, despite their heat-producing machines, were cold places for workers who had to brave the chill during breaks or before and after shifts. The lack of proper heating made winter deadly. Cold homes increased illness, weakened bodies, and contributed to early deaths. Children, the elderly, and the sick were most at risk. In short, coal was more than just fuel. It was survival. Without it, winter was a slow, freezing death. Despite the brutal winters that crushed Victorian London with cold, hunger, and despair, the city and its people didn't just surrender. Amid the fog and frost, hope flickered. Small acts of kindness, innovation, and change that would eventually transform life in the coldest months. One of the earliest rays of hope came from public health reformers. Doctors and social activists began exposing the deadly links between poor housing, bad sanitation, and winter illnesses. The fog that once seemed inevitable was recognized as a killer, and campaigns for cleaner streets and better ventilation gained momentum. The fog slowly started investing in improvements to housing. Though progress was slow, new laws were passed to outlaw some of the worst slum conditions, insisting on better insulation, drainage, and access to fresh air. These changes helped reduce the deadly impact of winter cold on families living in cramped, damp homes. Communities banded together too. Neighborhoods formed informal mutual aid groups, sharing firewood, food, and clothing with those in desperate need. Charitable organizations and religious groups increased their efforts, setting up soup kitchens, shelters, and clothing drives that saved countless lives during the harshest months.
Technological innovation played a role as well. The expansion of the railway and underground transport systems made travel easier and safer, reducing the dangers of frozen streets. New heating technologies, like improved stoves and the gradual introduction of gas heating, helped people warm their homes more efficiently. Even in art and literature, the brutal winters inspired awareness. Writers and painters highlighted the struggles of the poor, stirring public sympathy and support for reforms. Despite these advances, winter remained a challenge. But Victorian London's resilience laid the groundwork for the modern city's battle against cold. By understanding the horrors and hardships of those brutal winters, we see how far we've come, and how much the spirit of survival, community, and innovation helped Londoners endure. So next time you complain about a cold snap, remember, Victorian London survived winters that were not just cold, but deadly. And they did it with grit, hope, and sometimes sheer stubbornness.